I would like to very quickly introduce our two speakers today and panelists. Hagai Elad, he is the executive director of the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, based in Jerusalem. And we have Mahmoud Abu Rahma, who is director of communications of Al-Mesan Center for Human Rights, based in Gaza. The afternoon will start by Hagai and Mahmoud will each give a short presentation of the situation from their perspective. And then we will have a conversation here together. I have some questions for them. But we would also like you to be able to ask questions as well. And in order to help you to formulate brief questions and clear questions, we ask you to write your question on a paper. And hopefully so that Joachim and Magnus, who is over there, can read it. And so you can give your questions on the paper to them during the whole session here. And then we will take those questions in the end. Okay? Who will want to start?
Yeah.
Hagai?
Sure.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you all for taking the time and attending this. I hope it will be as interesting as Agneta has promised. I think for me, often, this is like a very peaceful atmosphere and a very peaceful session. So that's dramatically in contradiction to the sense of violence, oppression, outrage, pain of an entire people living under occupation for more than half a century. And for me, in these kind of presentations and settings, it's kind of painful to be at such an emotional distance from the actual reality on the ground. But it's difficult to import that kind of sense of the reality. So what I want to do is start by sharing with you it's a 1-minute video clip of B'Tselem that will perhaps give you like a sense of not only of the facts, but also of the emotions. Please.
شو بدك هدول الولاد شو بدك فيهم؟ هذا بيبي صغير
كل شلي كل ارث شلي
Thank you. In the images that you saw here, you also saw in the beginning, you saw some soldiers entering into a Palestinian home. And I want to just take that example, Israeli soldiers entering a Palestinian home, and to spend a few minutes with you discussing that specific example. Because you may think that the soldiers may have had a probable cause. Maybe they have a search warrant. Maybe they have received a judicial approval to do that thing. And just like think about your homes. Of course, like that's what we would assume, right? That if a police officer would have the possibility of entering our home, then those kind of like judicial barriers will exist there for that to take place. We feel very protected in our homes as we should be. That's not the case in the occupied territories. And that's not because these are bad soldiers or soldiers that have acted against the law. That is military law in the occupied territories. Military law since 1967 is that Israeli soldiers can basically enter, almost any soldier can enter almost any home anytime. Okay, that's the reality. And this is not just theoretical, it actually happens. And since B'Tselem had this rather broad project with video volunteers, it sometimes happens that the soldiers enter a home in which a Palestinian family has a video camera and they document what happened. And you saw a few seconds of that in this video. And if you go on the B'Tselem website or the B'Tselem YouTube channel, then you could see much more extensive documentation of that phenomena. Now that's terrifying. It's terrifying if it's happening in the afternoon. It's much more terrifying if it's happening at 3 a.m. in the morning, even if the soldiers are absolutely polite, waking everyone up, taking the names of everyone, bring all the children to the living room, what are their names, take their photographs, thank you very much, even when they're totally polite and they leave the home. Just try to imagine that thing happening. No warrant needed, no judge needs to review this. That's the law. That's totally okay. Now, what I want to try and invite you to think about, and for me that's one of the most painful aspects of this entire reality, think about the moments in which what I've just described isn't happening, isn't taking place. But you're a Palestinian mother or father or kid, and you know every second that what I've just described may actually take place. Right? You grow up with that realization. As a parent trying to grow a family, you're aware of that all of the time. And now just try to imagine like that reality sinking in for more than half a century. To what extent is your life like absolutely exposed to decisions of Israelis, of Israeli authorities, of military commanders, of military judges, of Israeli planners, of Israeli legislators, of Israeli voters? We make all the decisions. We run almost all aspects of Palestinian life through arbitrary decisions that we make. And if all that is not enough, then Israel insists that we should all accept that as democratic. And why is that so? Because in Israel, we have elections proper, as may happen in a few months' time, and as happens every approximately 4 years, sometimes at a higher pace than that when the elections cycle is shorter. So between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, we have 13 million people that live on that small patch of land. I'm an Israeli citizen, I'm one of them. But out of those 13 million, only approximately 8 million Israeli citizens like myself have a chance to participate in the political process. And when we vote, and when we choose our own government, we choose the authority that also dictates the lives of Palestinians, whether they live in illegally annexed East Jerusalem, or whether they live in the occupied West Bank, or if they live in the Gaza Strip, which is under external Israeli control through a blockade that has been going on for more than a decade. And because all this is run also through the decisions of the democratic elections that we have, then you are somehow expected to accept this reality as democratic, even though 5 million out of 13 million not having a say with regard to the way their lives are conducted is inherently undemocratic. Now, I want to take a step, not a step back, but a step aside, and also focus just for a couple of minutes on one other unique aspect of this reality, because I already said that Israel's expectation is that we should all somehow accept this inherently undemocratic reality as democratic, contradiction in terms, but that's the propaganda line. But there's also close attention and scrutiny and effort by Israel to make all this thing seem legal, right? Now, Israel is not the worst human rights violator on the planet. There are worse than us. But Israel does insist, to a great extent, to spend quite a lot of effort in convincing you that everything that you saw in this short video clip and many, many other routine, systematic, ongoing, policy-driven human rights violations of Palestinians are legal. They're legal because we have Israeli lawyers that write detailed opinions that explain this. They're legal because Palestinians have the ability to petition the Israeli High Court of Justice and lose most of those cases, and you should respect, supposedly, those decisions, and so on and so forth. So Israel does take the time and does make the effort to cross the T's and dot the I's and write the legal opinions that will serve as effective propaganda so that we would come to accept these unacceptable human rights violations as something that is compatible with the law. And since myself, I happen to not be a lawyer and to be a person that has no legal education, then I feel somewhat more comfortable to sometimes talk about this sense of like to what extent there's an effort to deny the possibility of normal, non-lawyer people like myself to talk about human rights. Like if you don't have an advanced law degree, then like how can you have even an opinion with regard to the fact whether the demolition of an entire Palestinian village, for instance, is legal or not legal? And I think that it's not a bad idea at all to try and go back to basics and remind ourselves that our laws are supposed to represent our values, are supposed to represent values of justice, rule of law, democracy, not in the formal sense, but in the true sense of these words. And I have a strong belief that normal people have good intuitions with regard to identifying injustice. And if you've heard what I've just said 30 seconds ago, the demolition of an entire Palestinian village, maybe that has stricken you as something that sounds unjust, even though you do not have an advanced degree in international humanitarian law, and you're totally on the mark. You haven't missed anything. That is illegal, that is unacceptable, that is unjust, and that's something that we should all feel comfortable to reject from our understanding of justice and morality. The last thing I want to say in conclusion is also that, of course, all this has a deep and significant international context. First, and again, that runs in the face of ongoing Israeli propaganda that says that, if people in Sweden or people elsewhere around the world have anything to say with regard to this, then that's undermining Israeli sovereignty, that is meddling in Israel's own internal affairs in such arguments. So it embarrasses me that I even need to waste a minute of your life in rejection of that documentation, but since that kind of propaganda is deployed on such a routine and ongoing basis, then just lend me your patience and allow me to do that for a minute. First and foremost, going back to basics, going back to the principles of human rights. Human rights never know no boundaries. Human rights are never the internal affair of any country, and that's part of our shared responsibility as human beings towards one another. If that's not enough, we're also talking in the context of Gaza, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, the occupied Palestinian territories, we're talking about, as I said, systematic, ongoing, policy-driven human rights violations that are taking place outside the internationally recognized boundaries of my country. This is inherently an issue of international concern. This is one of the most important human rights challenges of the 21st century, and the world has a responsibility to intervene. The world has a responsibility to be more involved and more assertive so that what we do isn't just continue to have conversations and discussions and expressions of concern with regard to reality that has already been allowed to go on for half a century, and if we are not rejecting it in an assertive way from the podium of the international community, the only thing that we will see is the ushering in of what has already begun to be the second half of the first century of this unacceptable reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hagai. And with that, I leave the floor to you directly, Mahmoud.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for the organizers, for everyone who has come to listen to us today. Sorry if we will leave you in the end a little bit more depressed and pessimistic. We will only try to reflect what the reality is. My organization is based in Gaza. We focus almost all our work on Gaza for good reason. The situation there is telling. But let me start first with some flashes as to why this moment in time is probably significant. This year marked 25 years of 25 years of the Oslo Accords, 25 years of negotiations, 25 years of continuous settlements, fragmentation of the Palestinian people that have led us here, a quarter of a century. It has led us to a place that is much worse for us, Palestinians, and I would also believe for the Israelis. It is time to draw lessons from this and realize that going on with the same path is the most wrong way to go. Today is important because it's a Friday, and now at this moment there are demonstrations in Gaza. During the past 8 months, there were days when dozens of people were killed by snipers. Thousands have been injured when they were demonstrating near the border, unarmed, not posing any imminent threat on anyone. And that happened with the blessing of the Israeli High Court, to which we complained unsuccessfully, unfortunately. These days are also important. Only 2 days ago, we were at the brink of the possibility of another war on Gaza. Luckily, there has been a truce that has been holding on, but this situation is untenable and is not sustainable, and we need to keep that in mind. So I was born and lived almost all my life in the Gaza Strip, and the situation now is as follows. Gaza is a small territory, 360 square kilometers. The population is almost 2 million people. 69% of them are under the age of 29. Gaza has been under a closure regime since the 1990s. This regime has exacerbated into a full closure, full siege of the Gaza Strip in 2007. Added to this regime is a regime we call the buffer zone, that these are areas, no-go areas in the sea and on the ground. This area is enforced by the Israeli army by one tool, and that is opening fire at anyone who enters this area, be them fishermen, be them farmers, residents of the area, or anything. The years of closure have destroyed the infrastructure in Gaza. Almost 0% now of the water is drinkable and usable. We have to put our sewage water into the Mediterranean, which is bringing it back to the aquifer for us. The public health system is in a miserable condition. The health system is unable to help people, and that's why we have to refer thousands of people every month to hospitals outside of the Gaza Strip, mainly Palestinian hospitals in the West Bank, but then they have to cross the Erez crossing that is controlled by Israel, and that's where misery starts. Last year, 54 patients died waiting for a permit to cross to a hospital that is 1 or 90 minutes away from them. Why? We don't know. We can see the new generations that have been born into this situation. They know only Gaza. They have lived 70% or so of them in poverty. More than 45% of them have lived all their life in extreme poverty, day in and day out. They don't have any hope for the future or any vision as to how they will grow up into fully developed and normal people. And we look at this and we worry, because this is a lost generation, and this formula of closure and isolation is very, very dangerous, especially as there are also military attacks that are harming people and civilians in the Gaza Strip. I think the United Nations has been vocal on the situation in Gaza, declaring 4 years ago that by 2020, Gaza would not be a livable place, that it would not be able to provide for dignified human life. This forecast has been reduced because the acceleration of the deterioration in Gaza has been going very bad and much quicker than expected. Now, what we are trying to do as a human rights organization is to look at the situation, identify specific situations where there are violations of human rights and international humanitarian law committed either by the Palestinian authorities or by the Israeli authorities. I will talk about the Palestinian authorities in a minute. And with this documentation, we try to provide legal advice and legal aid for people, trying to help them find legal recourse against the violations. We publish reports about these violations, and we do international advocacy and litigation about them. So we're frequently at the United Nations, the European Union, and this is part of also what we are doing. But this job is becoming increasingly difficult. The volume of violations is becoming too massive for us to handle. And the pattern is only worsening. A larger number of violations and severer violations every time problems happen. And the question then is, why is this happening? Why is Gaza is put in this position? Why what Haggai described is going on in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Area C, etc., etc. And I think we can take the word of Israeli officials, Israeli government, who have declared in more than one occasion that the strategy towards the Palestinian territories is to fragment the Palestinians, isolate them, and annex land and natural resources to Israel. This view of a settlement to the situation in the region cannot be achieved without these human rights and international law violations. There has to be a regime that produces this outcome, and this regime has definitely to violate the basic principles of international law. So we are dealing with a situation that is continuing, that has reached a crisis point a long time ago. But then in Gaza, we also look and we find that the Palestinian authorities, and we have two authorities, unfortunately. The Palestinian Authority that is ruling in the West Bank, but also has a lot of influence in Gaza, and the de facto authorities led by Hamas in Gaza. And we look at them creating an atmosphere of political rivalry and split that necessarily will lead to severe human rights violations, including oppression of the political opponents, violation of freedom of expression, violation of freedom of assembly, etc., etc. And that is adding a lot to the situation I described in the Gaza Strip. We are human rights organizations who apply the principles of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We will document and criticize all these violations. Unfortunately, we are faced with a serious dilemma, and that dilemma is the culture of impunity and the lack of accountability and access to justice for the victims, who are mostly the civilian population in Gaza. We try to access the Israeli justice system, and we are failing because it has been designed, as Haggai said, in such a way not to deliver justice or provide protection for the most vulnerable and the victims of this situation. We try to access the Palestinian justice system, and we find it fragmented and incapable and a little bit politicized and are not able to deliver everything that we want. So our only hope at the moment is that we find solace and we find refuge in the international accountability mechanisms that have to step in and that have to be used effectively in order to provide this missing aspect, that is protection for the civilian population and prevention of violations of human rights law and international humanitarian law. We are going through a very difficult time also because along the political lines we see in Israel and unfortunately in Europe and elsewhere, the new lines are as follows. You are either critical of the occupation and of injustice, in which case you will be labeled something. We have been labeled as terrorists. They have been labeled as traitors. Many of our friends have been labeled as anti-Semites only because we are opposing and are critical of the occupation and of the violations of international law that is going on. Or you are on the other side and are supportive of the occupation, in which case, good luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mahmoud. I would like to start by asking you a couple of questions related to Swedish friends that I have, neighbors, etc. Sometimes when the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is mentioned, I can hear people reacting in a very dismissive way, basically saying, oh, these people down there, they just hate each other. They will always fight. And they think that or consider that you are, as we say in English, cut from the same cloth. In Swedish, kålsuparteorin. How would you react to that kind of feeling from Swedish people? And the bottom line is, why should we care? They will continue to fight no matter what we do. What would be your answer to my neighbors?
First, I'll say that I think we should listen to that with some level of understanding, I think, and compassion. This is a reality that has been going on for such a long time. It's been going on, as I kept saying already, for more than half a century. It's been normalized in many ways by more than 2 generations already of Palestinians and Israelis living under this reality. And of course, for people that live not immediately in the region, further away, in Sweden or in other parts of the world, I think that may seem even more so. And sometimes people talk about fatigue from the issue. And of course, there are also many other human rights priorities and other important issues and crises around the world. And I respect that, and I acknowledge that. I think there's no question with regard to that. And I think also there's a lot of responsibility, first and foremost, on the leadership of both Israelis and Palestinians. I'm not shying away from that in any shape or form. Having said that, I think that first I need to attach a huge asterisk to what I've just said, because when I use sentences such as the failure of the leadership of Israelis and Palestinians and such sentences, or people framing this in the context of a conflict, then I think what it immediately invokes is two countries that are fighting each other, two equal sides of equal strength that are fighting it out, right? This is not that reality. First, there's a huge imbalance of power between Israelis and Palestinians, and secondly, there's no war in that sense. There is no, there's an occupying power, my country, and there's an occupied people that lives under that reality. And of course, yes, there's ongoing violence, which we absolutely reject, that manifests itself in variously horrifying ways. And nevertheless, what we're talking about is one of the longest military occupations in modern history. That's that reality. And I believe very, very deeply that people of privilege have a responsibility to address injustices. And the people that are in privileged positions with regard to the oppression of the Palestinian people are Israelis, like myself, and are internationals. And especially since this occupation is happening in a very well-documented and well-known international context, and that international context is actually in many ways supporting the continuation of this injustice, then that puts even more responsibility on the international community and of like-minded people around the world that share our values, values that demand a future built on democracy, freedom, equality, rule of law for everyone, to do what they can to take nonviolent action in order to demand an end for this injustice.
I would also appreciate and understand the feelings coming out of what we consider fatigue. 50 years, 51 years now of occupation is a very long time. The system, the regime that has been developed to maintain this reality is too complex and too vast and too difficult to understand. You will have too much information about this that is so contradictory that many people feel unable to what to make out of it. But the reality is simple, and I think it can be understood. And I won't add to what Haggai said about the situation where there's an occupation and there's occupied people. That doesn't mean the occupied people are saints. That means necessarily they are humans and they are under pressure and they will make mistakes. And there are so many things that Palestinian society also doesn't agree about. But I will also say that it's necessary that human beings show solidarity. And I think only a couple of generations after Europe's devastating wars, this sense of solidarity should not be lost. It is dangerous that it is lost. We are neighbor. We are the backyard of Europe, and there's no way I can see that peace and security in our region does not influence Europe, including Sweden, in certain direct and indirect ways. And you've experienced maybe the impact of several other conflicts. My last point would be actually going with the moral rule that says, if you can, then you ought to. Europe and Israel have very significant trade relations, cultural relations, and Europe has enabled somehow the situation first to develop, but also to be maintained this way. And I already spoke about the Oslo Accords, Oslo being a European capital, etc. And with this comes responsibility. If you enable a situation and allow it to go this way through trade, etc., then you also have leverage over it. And if you don't use that leverage, I think you are missing out on a responsibility that should be taken up.
Fortunately, we do have many people in Sweden who really care and who follows the conflict both in media and through different, your websites, for example, and who knows quite a lot. And sometimes maybe we care too much. Probably you know, you who are sitting in this room, that for some reason, when this conflict, should be discussed, it always gets so emotional. And I have many times wondered why. People who can discuss in a, intellectual way, they can argue with people who don't have the same opinion as themselves, basically any other issue. But when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian question, it suddenly becomes so sensitive and emotional. Why do you think that is?
I think it's a combination of both good faith and bad faith factors. I think that questions of grave moral responsibility sometimes do lend themselves to more heated debates. And, I wasn't necessarily, I wasn't there when, people were debating apartheid in South Africa, or when people were debating the Deep South in the US under Jim Crow, and like other injustices in history that are not identical in their details, but are similar in their level of immorality. And, from our perspective, this injustice needs to be rejected in the same way and with the same commitment in which those previous historical injustices were rejected, without being identical in every detail, because there are no two historical analogies that are totally identical. It's pointless to look for that. It is useful to look at history as a moral compass, not to look for copy-paste situations that never existed and never will exist, but shouldn't push us away from coming to the moral conclusions that we need to come to. So I think that's the good faith context in which perhaps these debates sometimes become heated. I think that the bad faith aspect of that is part of an ongoing Israeli effort to silence the debate. And the technique that is used in order to silence that debate, Mahmoud has already mentioned that. It's either a Palestinian is speaking against the occupation, rejecting the occupation, must be associated with violence or terrorism in some way. If an Israeli does that, it must be a collaborator with the enemy or a traitor to his people or a fifth column. And if it's an international, then you must be an anti-Semite. And of course, when that kind of rhetoric, that kind of language is introduced into an argument, then it doesn't help having a factual-based, principled conversation about issues that we may have a disagreement on, and instead of that, it fast forwards that into the realm of a screaming match. But that's part of, as I said, a bad faith effort to silence the conversation and to drag us away from discussing the facts through the usage of such false propaganda.
To start where you ended, I really hope that people will insist that when they have a conversation about this issue, that they have a nuanced conversation, not just a heated debate around the two lines I mentioned earlier, with occupation or anti-occupation. The facts need to be properly, again, there's too much information going around about the situation in our region. And I think people need to look carefully at the facts and not just listen to the simplified messaging that is going here and there. I want to add two more factors that that have to do, in my opinion, to this situation. One is the modern European history. There are elements, dark elements in European recent history that are adding another aspect to the conversation about this part of the world. Part of it is religious conventions, but part of it also the recent history in Europe and the sensitivity that is coming from that, and which is sometimes, unfortunately, abused by people with bad faith, as you described them. But I must say that the more recent reality and the changes in Europe now are also adding to this situation. We can see a wave of populism in Western societies, North America, Europe, also now South America and elsewhere. And a clear aspect of it is full support to the current Israeli government without questioning or any nuanced conversation. And that is problematic. That is problematic in many ways, including because of the many components of this populist right wing, actually, which is strongly anti-Semitic sometimes, Islamophobic, etc., and which is using this discourse for internal political reasons.
Now, I have been thinking quite a lot about this, and my own take is also what you mentioned here, that religion is part of it, history is part of it, politics, of course, and sometimes these arguments are mixed, sometimes not on purpose, and as you say, sometimes on purpose. And I sometimes quote the late Prime Minister in Israel, Sharon. He said once that the Palestinians, they have the Oslo Agreement. We, the Israelis, we have something stronger. We have the Bible. And that is a typical example, I think, of mixing different kind of arguments that can become very emotional. Now, the theme for these days here is the right to a life free from violence. Does it make sense, you think, to focus on violence in a human rights context? Shouldn't you talk more about human rights in a sort of more positive way? Mahmoud, what do you say?
I say I wish I could. The reality is a reality of armed conflict, international armed conflict, a reality of multiple conflicts that are producing violence. Some of it is seen in the public sphere, but a lot of it also is not as clearly seen. We would have loved to be living in a stable country free of armed conflict, where we have a state that is responsible for the well-being and the rights of its population, and where we can speak more positively about human rights as an approach towards dignified human rights, development, etc., and we are longing to that day. And actually, part of our agenda is about this to the extent possible. But we are also driven by the facts of daily life. We have had to deal with over 500 of cases of patients in 11 months this year. Patients, again, who need access to a hospital only 60 to 90 minutes away from them, and many of whom will suffer and die if they don't. We have had to deal with hundreds of cases of people who are shot, and killed, and injured, etc. So we are driven by basically what we have to deal with. And violence is part of of this problem. And the problem with this violence is a factor that is affecting the whole range of human rights and dignity of people, not only in our region, but elsewhere. So you can't really claim that you are trying to work on and defend human rights without dealing with the root causes of violence and trying to deal with it.
Would you say that it affects men and women in a different way?
Definitely. Violence that is infused by armed conflict affects women and women disproportionately. It affects more women who find themselves in weaker positions. It affects them also. I mean, in Gaza, for example, more and more families are becoming headed by women in an environment where poverty and unemployment is rampant, but they still have to shoulder these issues more and more.
Haggai, you have written or talked about bureaucratic violence. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like an effort to respond to this false image, false analysis, that, you know, as if the situation in the occupied territories is not violent, but if suddenly there are attacks with rockets or with knives by Palestinian perpetrators against Israeli citizens, then suddenly there is violence. Now, of course, when that happens, that means that there is violence, and that violence is, of course, absolutely not acceptable. Attacks against civilians are never acceptable for any reason, in any shape or form, in totality. But when that happens, there will be headlines. There will be headlines in Israel, and often also be headlines around the world. Just as there's been attention to Gaza in recent months because of not only the events of the last few days, but also the demonstrations since March 30, with the huge number of Palestinian casualties in those demonstrations, more than 5,500 Palestinians that have been shot by live munition during those demonstrations, as one fact of that reality, and of course the many that have been killed. But put all that aside for a minute and think again about the days in which there's no headline because there's no violence. But in those days, those are days in which patients in Gaza are not receiving permits to travel to the West Bank to receive medical treatment. And those are days that people in the West Bank are living with the knowledge that maybe their home will be demolished, or maybe soldiers will enter their home, or maybe the permit that they have in order to work their field on the other side of the separation barrier in the area locked within the Green Line and where Israel built a barrier, maybe that permit will be revoked. And they actually don't know if maybe like a family member wants to travel abroad. That too is under Israeli control. Just think about that. Like, what kind of countries in the world had the ability to control the ability, well, I'm not talking about even citizens, of like non-citizens, to travel out of that area, not only with regard to what sometimes is discussed, the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza that rarely have a chance to travel out of what has become one of the most densely populated places on earth, but also in the West Bank. And all of these aspects and many more aspects of totally routine, mundane aspects of Palestinian life, things that we all take for granted, are all subject to Israeli arbitrary decisions that are bureaucratic and are meant to be used, and are used, not just in their meaning, but again, not only arbitrary, but part of our control and oppression of the Palestinian people, because what Palestinians know is that, you know, maybe you're going to get a permit, but permits always need to be renewed and can always be revoked. And if you do the wrong thing, or a family member does the wrong thing, or if someone who's not even a family member, but just happens to share the same family name with you, as you, that too has been happening in the West Bank, then maybe those permits will be taken away. And that is ongoing, as if invisible, bureaucratic violence that Palestinians are subject to all the time. And that is taken to be routine, acceptable, invisible, and as if that is not violent.
The title of this particular session is To Work for Human Rights in Headwinds. And that is something that both of you know all about. We can see a shrinking space for human rights activists, not only in your region, but actually in many places in the world. And in fact, the two of them have written an article which is published today in the Svenska Dagbladet about this issue. We have, in relation to this, we have a question from the public. What is the situation for human rights organizations in Israel now, today?
Okay, so one of the, I already alluded to that we work in, as I said before, that the describing of us as traitors, collaborators with the enemy, a fifth column, and so on. I've become so used to saying that and like if there's a week in which the prime minister or government minister or member of Knesset, of parliament from the coalition, won't use one of those terms with regard to an Israeli human rights organization, then I need to check what's wrong, right? It has become so routine, so mundane, and we all got so used to it. So I think sometimes I need to force myself to wake up and remind myself that actually that's not normal. That's not the way it's supposed to be. We are not enemies we are not traitors. We reject occupation. We reject injustice. But this, the framing of us as such is absolutely unacceptable as much as it's become routine. And this expresses itself in a variety of ways. So one is these ongoing statements, sometimes from government officials, and many times by as if independent, what has become known as bad civil society organizations that do the government's propaganda and will use the same language or worse language and have various campaigns against us. One of those campaigns, there was actual imagery of 4 Israeli human rights activists. I was one of them, portrayed as actually stabbing Israelis in the back at the same time in which there were such attacks by Palestinian perpetrators against Israeli citizens. So, and of course, this framing is not. This is dangerous. We all know how traitors, how collaborators with the enemy needs to be treated, and that creates a certain political atmosphere which is not only unacceptable but also dangerous. The most and what goes on in addition to that are ongoing legislation efforts trying to limit our capacity to do our work, to limit access to international funding and other aspects of our work. And that too has become quite routine and ongoing. And even if many of those initiatives do not reach the final point of becoming a law, in the meantime, they're part of perpetuating this atmosphere, because it once again puts forward that kind of debate. To what extent is the government fighting against the fifth column? And sometimes they do get legislated. The last, most recent, very visible example of this, I'll just spend a minute describing that, was a couple of weeks ago when I was briefing the Security Council in New York, and the Israeli ambassador to the UN was there at the Security Council chamber and was responding to my comments. And it was he had something that he said in English and something that he said in Hebrew. In English, what he said is that the presence of an Israeli human rights activist at the Security Council is an expression of how strong Israeli democracy is, and especially when compared to the situation in other countries in the region and so on. You can see the exact quotes. You can find it on YouTube and online. And then Ambassador Danon switches to Hebrew, a language that he knows that probably know, like I understand, he understands, but and the people that are watching TV back in Israel, because this was on live TV, so basically he's talking to the audience back home and saying, you know, shame on you, you're a collaborator with the enemy. So in English, like Israel is a democracy because it has civil society and human rights organizations that can do their work freely, and in Hebrew, basically threatening me in front of everyone. And that's really the reduction of democracy to a hollow brand that is void of its essence and is just used as a commodity, a propaganda commodity for expert purposes, because looking outside, Israel is a democracy and you should respect it. And looking inside, the government is fighting the enemy from within.
Before we listen to you, Mahmoud, we have a question here which is related to what you said, I think. So I want to read it. My impression is that the increased radicalization of the Israeli administration has also led to a more aggressive attitude to formerly tolerated institutions like the ICC, for example. Like the international or domestic institutions. How do you interpret this? Maybe that's what you just answered, but...
Yeah, maybe just like 2 more sentences about that.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, there's an international context that is part of this. And it's not only that we have the most right-wing government in Israel's history in power in recent years, but there's also the international context. And when that context is more effective, also in terms of not just in the context of rejection of the occupation, which is not as far from being remotely as effective as it needs to be, but also in the context of what happens with regard to the way Israeli human rights organizations are treated. And in that sense, the changes in the US and with Trump in the White House, then there's a sense by the Israeli government that not only it can get away with doing much more, much faster and much worse to Palestinians without any significant pushback, and in fact with this, what seems to be like a huge green light coming from Washington, but also in a similar way with regard to the ill treatment and attacks against Israeli civil society. And I dare say even to take it beyond that, because for these statements, when they do come to have an impact, they need to come with moral gravity. And you know, the damage that has been done during the last 2 years by the Trump administration to the U.S. credibility in that sense, that I think even if tomorrow there would have been such a statement from the State Department, not that I expect it, but who would take it seriously after the last 2 years?
Mahmoud, I wonder, I mean, when the human rights movement in Palestine started, you were focused on the Israeli violations of human rights. After the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, you have also opened, as you sometimes say, the Palestinian agenda. So you are also critical towards the Palestinian Authority, towards de facto authority in Gaza, Hamas. And I know that your organization has contributed quite a lot to the recent Human Rights Watch report about torture in Palestinian detention centers. The fact that you have also started to look into violations on the Palestinian side, how has that affected you in Palestine?
Well, there have been 2 stages, actually, in relation to this. First, a stage of optimism and positive outlook that we forced ourselves to believe in. And that's between 1994, 5, until the year 2000, when it appeared that there is a possibility that the negotiations might lead to a Palestinian state that is sovereign and that can make its own decisions and futures as to its laws, democratization, reality, etc. So at that time, we had 2 agendas internally. One is to monitor the violations of human rights and criticize them, get people out of prison, ensure the due process. And then the second is to encourage development and going towards more respect of economic, social, and cultural rights, etc. This all changed suddenly in the year 2000, I think, and we had to shift to more international humanitarian law-related issues. And then even more in 2007 when the political split between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas occurred. But it's simple in our mind, where you have responsibility as an authority. To the extent of that responsibility, of that authority and control, you have responsibilities. That's the logic of the rule of law and human rights. And therefore, to the extent of where the Palestinian authorities have control over the Palestinian population's lives, they have responsibilities. And if they don't act on them and respect human rights, we definitely will apply the same human rights and international law principles on them. How it affected us, it has made our life very difficult. We have to deal with two massive agendas in a situation that keeps worsening. And in fact, as organizations, we are frustrated because we plan and we strategize and we achieve a lot. And in 3 years, we find the situation has worsened. So it is a tricky situation for us. But let me comment on also the pressures and threats Palestinian human rights defenders and organizations are exposed to. And there, I think we were shocked in 2015 when we read the analysis of the Israeli security establishment concluding that human rights organizations who work on accountability at the international level, for example, on the ICC, and the BDS movement represent an existential threat on the state of Israel. Some of them describe it as more dangerous than Iran at the time. We were shocked because this is a little bit too much, actually, for us. We've never thought about ourselves to be as such. But with this came another statement that the state of Israel would start to use its full capabilities against us. And that's when we started to feel the surveillance, that defamation campaigns online, defamation campaigns among our constituents and donors and our standing in society. But it went even further than that, with direct threats and attacks on human rights defenders who are doing this kind of work, and the aggressive approach where you have a prime minister actually lobbying prime ministers and foreign ministers around the world to stop supporting human rights defenders in Palestine financially or politically, where Mr. Danon also the year before, only last year, standing at the Security Council and describing Palestinian organizations and Mizan al-Haq as terrorist organizations. This is a little bit too much. We have our fair share of criticism from the Palestinian authorities also, who frequently don't like what we say publicly. We are opposing many of the policies and the practices. But that says that we are possibly hitting the right nerve, and that is attracting pressures and other things on us.
Talking about shrinking democratic space, we have a question here about youth. In many places, youth are mobilizing despite shrinking democratic space in their own ways. Is there any signs of that in Israel-Palestine?
I can speak about Palestine. The demonstrations that are happening now in Gaza were started by a call from youth groups in Gaza. Civil society organizations and political powers joined later. In 2011, we almost had a Palestinian Spring. led totally by a very large number of young people who were motivated and working every day, and we lent them our support. I think young people have new tools using mobile phones, the internet, social media, that are struggling to understand fully, as a matter of fact. And they have been achieving good results, they are getting their voice heard more and more. The danger on that, I think, is the trend in our region, including in Palestine, that deals with what is called cybersecurity, where the states are legislating to control the cyberspace, where young people find this virtual space to meet and discuss and think and liaise and network and create new ideas. And that is a danger. And that is why particularly we're having a very heated fight to counter the law on cybercrime legislated by the Palestinian Authority, but also an amendment in Gaza enacted by the local authorities to the penal law that allows interference on Facebook posts and other things. We think this space needs to be protected, and these young people need to be lent a hand to improve their situation, improve their networking, and find a safe space to do the right thing. And that's why we also work with them on human rights approaches to activism.
I think that on the one hand, of course, but on the other hand, we again need to factor in more than half a century of normalization of this reality. And I think in like first approximation, when we are just born into a certain reality and grow up immersed in it, we tend to think about it as normal. It's the way things are. Like, why would we think of it as inherently unjust or unacceptable or exceptional compared to other realities? And that's a very high tide to try to educate with regard to even basic principles in the face of that. So think of something as as basic as equality before the law, right? Like the very basic and simple principle. But of course, if you think about Israeli settlers or Israelis that just happen to pass through the West Bank, and Palestinians living in the West Bank, they're not equal before the law. They're subject to two different planning regimes and two different legal systems, and so on and so forth. But for a lot of people in Israel, they are used to that reality, and they don't see that as a violation of that basic principle. So trying to re-invoke that, re-educate that, when reality is sending you all the time messages and headlines that are totally different and seem normal, all the time, then it's very, very, very difficult. And we are, as I keep saying, already that many, not just years, decades into that reality. So sometimes I try to imagine the healing process. I think the day after the occupation will end, I think we will begin having a fighting chance of really trying to have a reality that is genuinely based on those values and those principles. But so much work will need to be done to undo the damage of those by now 50+ years. By who knows when that day will come.
There is actually one question here. On a local level, are there any organizations that work with both Palestinian and Israelis towards eliminating prejudice?
Towards eliminating?
Prejudice. Between your...
Yeah, you want to start? There's plenty of NGOs that have been working over the years on in the jargon it's known as people to people, and a lot of efforts in that regard, so that Palestinians and Israelis will see each other as person to person as human beings. So first, I think we need to be reminded that there was, for no short time during the first decades of the occupation, there was much more freedom of travel between the occupied territories and Israel proper than there would have been many more direct encounters between Israelis and Palestinians. Hasn't quite resulted in an end for the occupation. Has become worse in recent years because, Gaza is almost completely blockaded off Israel. So, compare that to the situation, 30, 40 years ago. How many Israelis have actually, been to Gaza in recent years? Almost no one, and vice versa. So this reality of getting more and more a sense of just seeing each other as more distant enemies is also part of that reality. But we shouldn't confuse ourselves that it's just about renewed familiarity, because that doesn't factor in, as I said, the imbalance of power. And when you have an Israeli and a Palestinian in a friendly setting together, not against that in any shape or form, but that doesn't change the reality that you have two people sitting there together, one of them with political rights and the other one without political rights. One of them a citizen with all of the privileges of the occupying power, and the other one a non-citizen living under the rule of the other one. And I think that at least in some of those occasions, there's, even when it's done with absolute good faith, there's not enough acknowledgement of that power relationship that is inherently there every second.
Mm-hmm. And my observation would be it's only when you remove this imbalance in the power relations between the two and get the two sides where they can agree on a framework, shared values, etc., where they can effectively work together. Otherwise, all I can say is all the experiences we've witnessed in the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel to increase dialogue as a way to lead to a solution have failed, and failed with excellence sometimes in a very loud way, because the problem is not only that people are not interacting and speaking together. When people spoke together back in the 70s and the 80s, when Palestinians were free to move and work, there was still this imbalance where you lived in an occupied territory and went home to a refugee camp, and where the Israeli person was an employer, and sometimes the soldier who maintains this. It's worse now because, for example, in Gaza, the perception of the Israeli is the pilot or the soldier or the guard at areas or this or that, and the perception on the other side is, of course, the opposite. So that complicates things. So without dealing with this imbalance in the relation, I really don't think this will be an effective approach to end the problem. But there are some projects going on, and we are not opposing them.
Let us talk a little about the international community and the role of states, security, the UN, Security Council, the EU, etc., or individual states who might often, refer to the peace process, and often with an excuse of not wanting to interfere too much because they don't want to jeopardize the peace process. It seems that they also, the state community has a very clear picture of what the solution should be. And I will just quote a recent statement from the EU, but this could be from basically any state, I would say. We remain firmly convinced that the only lasting solution to the conflict in the Middle East is that of two democratic states Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders on the basis of the 1967 border and with Jerusalem as capital of both states, end of quote. If that is the only lasting solution, what are your reactions when you know that this is a statement from the EU countries?
Well, this could be a good solution.
Yes.
I think we're all struggling because for decades, this was the image of the word solution that we had in mind. There's occupied Palestinian territory, which could become a state, and Israel proper around the 1967 borders that could become a state, and with the presence of international community with arrangements that could have worked. But when you look at the reality on the ground, you'll see that this solution has been undermined too much. We can see this as people living in that space, where these lines of borders, virtual borders, have been blurred, where there has been too much forcible displacement from the Palestinian territories and within the Palestinian territories, and population transfer on the other side. The situation has become too complicated, and I think part of the reason why we are struggling is because we are still unable to imagine another solution after all this time. So I have only two comments about this. One, when international community, which is present very strongly and powerfully and physically in the area, in the region, when they speak about the Middle East peace process, what do they mean? I'd already given an idea about the Oslo process. This is where it has led us. If they mean the same process, it's a continuation of the problem. It's not a solution. My second point is, I don't really, as a human rights organization, I don't really mind how many states there will be in the region as a matter of solution. What is important is the recognition and respect of human rights and international law of all the people in this region. That should be our driving force towards dealing with the situation in our region, and not protecting a process that has, again, brought us to this spot where we are now, while sacrificing the dignity and the rights of the population. There can't be peace without justice and human rights.
If I just add to that, I think I'm just going to echo many of the words that Mahmoud has said. That, I mean, first, just like to acknowledge that, you know, we live in a one-state reality. We live in a one-state reality that, you know, I've described in the beginning of my remarks, and that's where we are. And under that overarching context, it is inherently undemocratic. That's the reality that we're in. So sometimes I know people tend to ask questions about the present in the future tense. So what do you think will be the case if, and then they describe actually the way things are. And I have to actually, but like, why are you talking about the future? Like, this is the reality that we already live in. And the other thing that, of course, needs to be said is that I think we actually take human rights very seriously. It's not a substitute for international relations or politics and so on, but it is the basis for the future in which we want to live. So as a guy that works in a human rights organization, you know, I have nothing to say with regard to the X-state solution, whether that's better or acceptable or not, and so on. I have no idea. Way above my pay grade. not my job. What is my job is to examine not these theoretical scenarios that I'll say in a second a bit more about the fact that we've been immersed in those theoretical scenarios for the past 25 years and what happened during those 25 years, but just to look at something which I think is like much more direct and much more accessible for everyone, which is facts on the ground. Like, what is the reality that we live in? And if that reality is based on the values that we believe in or not. Now, there are many possible future scenarios that could actually deliver decency, equality, human rights, rule of law, democracy for everyone. 1 state, 2 states, 5 states, some sort of more complicated. 1.5 is 2.3 states, as long as anyway. So, but there's one present and past by now and future, which is absolutely inconsistent with the realization of those values, and that's perpetual occupation, and that's where we're at. And the second thing that needs to be said, because this is like we're not having this conversation on like year 2 of this reality or on year 2 of peace negotiations or the peace process. Endless process, never peace. But in the meantime, reality isn't frozen. There's no status quo. Things are always advancing. Israel advancing its interests at the expense of the rights of Palestinians, and more what has become facts on the ground are being set. So, if you look at it from the pragmatic perspective of an Israeli that wants to advance our occupation project, and you take the last 25 years of peace negotiations, I think they would tell themselves, so far so good. Like, we've built X more settlements, we've displaced Y more Palestinians. Look at where we were 25 years ago. Look at where we are now. Let's go on. Let's negotiate for another 20 years while we are continuing to eat up and fragmentize what is supposedly will be decided at the end of negotiations, but actually is being decided day in and day out when we are negotiating and when we're not negotiating.
Now, we have a question here from the public, and if I rephrase it a little, because if Palestinians agree on giving up all land and live in Israel as the whole of historic Palestine, and it would be Israel, do you think they will enjoy life of all the rights and duties like equal citizen? And maybe I rephrase that and ask you, because I understand that that is really your point, that everyone in the region should enjoy equal rights. What can we, as the international community, do then in order to make that happen, or help you in making that happening? And if you could say something short about both states, but also human rights organizations and activists that we have here in the audience. What should we focus on?
Okay, so I just addressing us on that very quickly. I think when people say 2 states or 1 state or anything else, it needs to be unpacked. Because I think some of these expressions have become slogans that people toss around, and different people, again, in good faith and sometimes in bad faith, have very different meanings of them. And if I go to the question, which I take as a variation on the question of a 1-state future, then there's a big difference between thinking about that and thinking that that would immediately come with equal voting rights for all citizens in that future reality, or a variation on what we currently have, a 1-state reality in which millions of people have no political rights and no say with regard to the way things are led. And some people on the right in Israel have invested some thinking as to how actually have that and have a semblance of political rights, but at the same time maintaining absolute Jewish privilege and supremacy in dictating everything, and in a way that should somehow confuse all of you, so that you would still think about that as democracy. So
we need to wrap up.
yeah.
So yeah.
Okay. So Yeah.
Yeah,
But
I
so
mean,
maybe you want to.
I would totally agree. I think that the key word from what we said earlier, that if all people have equal rights, then the problem is gone. And there's an increasing number, I think, of Palestinians are speaking about that. You mentioned the European Union statement. The European Union also expressed opinions about the emerging one-state reality. But that's being ignored because the perception is that the Israeli government would be too much against that. The Obama administration also mentioned the same thing because that's what's happening on the ground. Again, to us, what counts is human rights, the dignity of people more than anything.
I'm sorry, we have a couple of more questions here, but it's Friday afternoon and we shouldn't keep you here too long, so I think it's time to conclude. And I want to do that by first thank the two of you very much for coming here. You are doing a very important work in extremely difficult circumstances. And I think that you are balancing very well between being very realistic, but at the same time try to create some hope. So we thank you for that. I want to thank the audience, and I want to thank Diakonia, who organized this. And finally, Hagai and Mahmoud, continue to work for human rights in spite of the headway. That's our wish.
We will.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.